Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the second part in our series, A Brief History of the United States and Current Race Issues. Thank you to the Knoxville Alumni Chapter for providing the Zoom link. They're having a happy hour tonight at 5 Central if you are interested. The link is in the chat. Last time we talked about microaggressions that occur in daily life, and our speakers shared their powerful stories. Today we'll talk about history. I was listening to reflections on the Derek Chauvin verdict on NPR, and one caller said, "We don't know history. We don't know how this country was founded." I would like to submit that we know a version of US history. It's the version we learned in grade school. However, history differs based on who is telling it. Perspective matters. Most likely you learned history, as I did, from a white male European perspective. You may have learned that Columbus discovered America. What is missing from that narrative is that European settlers engaged in genocide of the indigenous people as they took their land. You may have learned that a white man, Abraham Lincoln, ended slavery. What is missing from that narrative is the continued subjugation of African Americans through indentured servitude, financial exploitation, imprisonment, and voter suppression. If you've never heard of Black Wall Street or redlining, your US education missed a few things. Today we will hear about history from a couple different perspectives. We have the following esteemed panelists joining us again today. Connie Tsosie Haro, International Executive Board Member at Large from the Robert E. Redding Alumni Chapter, Jesse Bulluck, District 25 Alumni Chapter, and Jacqueline Justice from the South Sound Alumni Chapter. We'll start with Connie, who will give us a brief version of Indigenous history. If you want to learn more, you can watch her presentation of Indian Law 101, linked in the chat. Then Jesse will give us an overview of Black history with the focus on education and racial justice. We'll round it out with Jackie, who will cover anything we missed and bring us up to speed on the present issues. I'll then give the panelists a chance to give an overview of current issues and answer questions. Take it away, Connie.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you again for having me here. So yaat she conchetta Tsosie Haro yanishia tabahan nishlo tachini bashichin honatni dashichedo tabahan dashanella. So hello everyone. My name's Conchetta Tsosie Haro. I am from the Water's Edge clan. I am born for red running into the water. My maternal grandfather is one who walks around you, and my paternal grandfather is also Water's Edge. This is how we introduce ourselves in our language. And today we're going to talk about the early history of the United States. So historical perspective is important when it comes to not only the study of law, but also the practice of law. This is because we have to look at statutes, treaties, and cases to understand how many policies were created and implemented. This is especially true for those who practice Indian law. So I use this helpful roadmap to provide people with an idea of where we are in history. It's helpful to understand federal Indian policies with a historical timeline. So we have pre-contact, we have contact/coexistence, removal, assimilation, reorganization, termination, and self-determination. Pre-contact is pretty obvious. It's prior to any European contact on this country. Contact/coexistence is a time period when settlers and tribes were coexisting on this land. Coexisting includes cooperation in wars. Disease was widespread and decimated tribal communities. This is also the time period when first contact tribes established treaties with European colonizers. Those treaties were first negotiated between tribal nations and the United States to establish borders, and those were signed between two parties. Removal is when the federal government established policies to forcibly remove Native people from their lands. Two well-documented forced relocations were the Trail of Tears and the Navajo Long Walk. Assimilation includes the allotment era and Indian boarding schools with the primary objective of civilizing or assimilating Native people into westernized culture. Many Native children were forced to abandon their cultures, cut their hair, and were often punished for speaking their language. This brutal era had lasting effects on generations of families. Reorganization refers to the Indian New Deal or the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. A report known as the Merriam Report documented the years of failed federal Indian policy during the allotment era. This report helped encourage change such as the Indian Reorganization Act. The act ended land allotment and restored tribal ownership of certain surplus lands and encouraged tribal self-government. However, much of these changes required approval by the Secretary of the Interior, and this one-size-fits-all policy did not work for all tribes. The termination era refers to the federal government policy of making tribal members subject to the same laws, privileges, responsibilities of other U.S. citizens. This resulted in several tribes being terminated, which ended their political relationship with the United States. Lands were converted into private ownership or sold. Terminated tribes lost their land bases and plunged into economic depressions. The federal government also encouraged tribal members to utilize the relocation program to leave their homelands and find new life in urban areas. There are success stories, however, many also suffer the same economic disadvantages of the urban poor. Tribal self-determination refers to the movement when tribes sought to restore their communities, achieve self-government, encourage cultural renewal, and exercise greater control over the futures. Through this era, there is a passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Financing Act, Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. This era also saw the rise of prominent Native leaders who changed federal Indian policy and law. These leaders include John Echohawk and Ada Deer. But for today, we are going to focus on pre-contact, contact/coexistence, and removal. Jesse and Jackie will continue moving us forward throughout history until we reach today. And here is a map done by Aaron Carapella, who is Cherokee. This map provides an idea of where many tribal homelands were located. You can purchase prints of this map at tribalnations.com. And now we go into establishing the federal role. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution granted Congress the power to regulate commerce with tribes. This set forth a pattern of federal Indian law and policy. Between 1790 and 1834, Congress passed a series of trade and intercourse acts. These policies established federal control over the interaction between tribes and the general population. These acts also manage land policies, economic activities, and other activities that have become the bedrock of federal Indian policy today. During this time, we also have the treaty process occurring. Treaties have a moral and legal force that cannot be ignored. Treaties have given rise to special canons of construction, which treaties must be construed as tribes have understood them, and any ambiguities are to be resolved in favor of the tribe. The third canon of the construction is regarding what the congressional intent is. These canons have been developed and reiterated through various Supreme Court decisions. And part of those original Supreme Court decisions includes the Marshall Trilogy. To understand the beginnings of federal Indian law and policy, one must review the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy are three cases that form the basic legal framework for indigenous land claims, tribal sovereignty, and federal trust responsibility. Those three cases are Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and Wooster v. Georgia. Johnson v. McIntosh, this case involved a land dispute between Thomas Johnson and William McIntosh. Johnson purchased land from the local tribe, and McIntosh later obtained a patent to some land from the U.S. federal government. The court was asked to settle this dispute, and the court stated the tribe did not own the right to the land as the United States was a discovering nation. Thus, tribes could not sell lands to individuals. This is known as the doctrine of discovery. The court outlined the discovery doctrine that a discovering power gains the exclusive right to extinguish the right of occupancy of the indigenous occupants. The court further stated that when the colonies declared their independence from the crown, the U.S. inherited their right of preemption. Some important notes: the tribe was not present at the arguments and were unable to contribute to the record. This doctrine of discovery has served as a basis for disregarding any indigenous land claims. The second case we have is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. There were multiple attempts by Georgia to extinguish Indian title to the land. Georgia enacted a series of laws that divided up Cherokee territory among several state counties and extended state law into those territories. Those state laws invalidated Cherokee law and made any Cherokee attempts at self-governance illegal. To combat this intrusion, the Cherokee brought an original action in the Supreme Court as a foreign state within the meaning of Article 3, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. This case established tribes were not foreign nations, but domestic dependent nations, and likened the tribe's relationship with the U.S. as a guardian-ward relationship. This case has a mixed history. This case laid groundwork for the future protection of tribal sovereignty, but it also strengthened the view for those who believed tribes were not able to govern themselves. The third case we have is Wooster v. Georgia. The next term, the Cherokee Nation returned to the Supreme Court. Several missionaries were arrested by Georgia authorities for violating a state law that required non-Indians to obtain a license before entering Cherokee territory. 2 missionaries appealed their convictions, and the court held that the state does not have the authority to control activity within Cherokee territory. The court further held that the Cherokee Nation is a distinct political community, and protection does not imply the destruction of the protected. Despite this win, President Andrew Jackson proceeded with Cherokee removal a few years later. As we start to move through the timeline mentioned earlier, you can gain a sense of where we are in history. As the United States focused on westward expansion, much of the treaties were focused on removing certain tribes to the west. And in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. Some tribes went peacefully and others did not. This led to mass removals of tribes off desirable land areas, notably the Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee. In 1831, the Choctaw were the first to be removed, and their removal served as a model for all future forced removals. Seminoles were moved in 1832, the Creek in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and the Cherokee in 1838. The removal of the Cherokee is also known as the Trail of Tears. Manifest Destiny, which was coined around 1845, is the idea that the United States' divine destiny is to expand their dominion throughout the continent. This idea was used to justify the forced removal of many native tribes. In the spring of 1864, the United States forcibly removed the Navajo people from their lands. This is known as the Long Walk or Hueldi. On October 29, 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre occurred. 675 soldiers attacked the village along Sand Creek and massacred unarmed women, children, and elderly. This list is not exhaustive. Throughout the country, we have forced removals occurring throughout the United States. But as we go through the removal period, there are a few notable cases. But this case is specifically important because it affected jurisdiction and how tribes were able to enforce their own customary laws. During this period, the federal government established reservations to separate tribal nations from non-Indians. Over time, reservations came to be viewed as another method to civilize tribes. Each reservation had an Indian agent who was supposed to supervise the adaptation to the Western lifestyle. This includes on-reservation and off-reservation schools that were directed by religious organizations. Their goals were to Christianize the native people. During this time, some tribes were still exercising their own traditional customary laws to settle disputes between tribal members. This led to the case of Ex parte Crow Dog. Ex parte Crow Dog occurred around 1881. In 1881, a native man named Crow Dog shot and killed Spotted Tail, another native man. The matter was settled by the tribe and followed longstanding tribal customary law that had Crow Dog pay restitution to Spotted Tail's family. Despite this, the Indian agent had Crow Dog arrested, and he was indicted by a federal grand jury for the murder and manslaughter of Spotted Tail. Crow Dog petitioned the Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus, and the court accepted the case. The court held 9-0 that Congress had not granted federal courts jurisdiction over Indian on Indian crimes, and there was nothing in subsequent treaties that repealed the tribe's jurisdiction. This landmark case was a win for Crow Dog. However, this case marked the beginning of the federal government's erosion of tribal customary law. The court's decision from Ex parte Crow Dog caused an uproar that resulted in congressional action. In 1885, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act, which placed 7 major crimes under federal jurisdiction, exclusive of state jurisdiction, that were committed by a native person on another native person. These crimes included murder, manslaughter, rape, assault with intent to kill, arson, burglary, and larceny. The constitutionality of this act was challenged in 1886 in United States versus Kagama. In this case, a native man named Kagama was accused of murder, and the Department of Justice used this case to test the constitutionality of the Major Crimes Act. This case is important because it relied on the tribe's status as domestic dependent nations that was determined in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Despite being good law, this case is criticized for relying on powers that are not expressly granted to Congress. And despite this, Congress passed the Dawes Act the following year. The Dawes Act marks a shift in federal Indian policy to allotment and assimilation. The Dawes Act was passed in 1887, which granted the federal government the authority to break up tribal lands. Some believe that if individual tribal members were given plots of land to cultivate, that would speed up the assimilation process into mainstream America. There was no provision for the consent or consultation from tribes or tribal people. This greatly reduced tribal lands from 139 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres in 1934. 20 million of that 48 million acres were desert or semi-desert lands. Those who receive allotments found themselves subject to state property taxation that they could not pay. This also resulted in the selling of those allotments to pay those debts. These practices also resulted in checkerboarded areas of land where it alternated between Indian and non-Indian ownership. As I bring this presentation to a close, I have a list of resources to help your research and provide more in-depth answers to your questions. I still learn new things every day about the history of not only my people, but other Indigenous people as well. I hope that this helps guide your understanding about the policies and laws that affect our Indigenous people, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And with that, I will pass it on to our next presenter.
Thank you, Connie. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm going to hand it over to Jesse now. If you do have questions that come up, feel free to post them in the chat. Take it away, Jesse.
Hey, thank you, Corey. Good afternoon to everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jesse Bulluck, and I am a PhD alum living in North Carolina. So today, I wanted to speak with you about two areas that I do research in and presently work in. But I believe I may just limit it to one, and that being a focus on criminal justice issues. So we all, I guess by now, are aware of the verdict that came down yesterday regarding the killing of George Floyd. And excuse me if I seem to be just a little disturbed or whatever at this moment. It's a lot to take in, and it sort of is a real life example, a real time example for you of the range of emotions that Black people go through on a daily basis. So yesterday, on the one hand, we get this verdict regarding the killing of George Floyd. And for some, it is definitely a reason to celebrate because the officer was found guilty on all of the charges. And so there's a sense of relief or vindication, and the idea that George Floyd did not die in vain. But a little bit before we got that verdict, we learned that there was another killing of a young lady in Columbus, Ohio, Micaiah Bryant, 16-year-old young Black female. And while, the department in Columbus is still investigating the issue and, we don't know everything that happened, just the idea that another life has been lost is a lot to, deal with. But this is often the case for Black people living in the United States. There's often this range of emotion, and you keep asking, when will it end? When will it stop? And so just for my part, I wanted to give you some background on kind of how did we get to this point? How did we get to this point where we're seeing so many people be killed by the police or be shot by the police. So if we look at some of the data, there's a research group by the name of Mapping Police Violence. And according to their information, 181 Black people have been killed, shot by the police since George Floyd, or within this year, I believe. Sorry, within this year. And that amounts to about 18%, 19% of the people who have been shot by the police or killed by the police this year have been Black. And we know that Black people only make up 13% of the US population based on the most recent census. And so that's a pretty stark number. And when you start looking into the data, if you're a data-driven person, that translates into Black people being 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. And that's despite there being 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed. So they're having more Black people who are unarmed being killed and shot by police officers. And so again, you just, if this is an issue for you, you have to ask, like, why does this keep happening? What is going on? There has to be some connection that we're not making to continue to have these killings happen. And so when we look at the history of law enforcement in the country, you have to go back and, you go back to the colonial times, and, if you want to take the kind of more clean idea or historical view of it, you'll say that, law enforcement, police departments, they started because in the colonial times, they started developing what they call night watch. And the night watch, the duty was to kind of just oversee the towns and the areas during the nighttime. And oftentimes these were like just people who volunteered to do it. There was no like formal organization of it. And this started happening in the mid 1600s to early 1700s, mostly in the Northeast, in the Boston, New York, Philadelphia area, kind of the major cities at the time. But with the increased urbanization of the country during those centuries, we started getting more organized police forces, with the first one being established in the Boston area around 1838. So while we have that going on in the North, what's happening in the South? So we all know that in the South, the economy was driven by slavery. And so what ended up happening in that part of the country was you had the establishment of slave patrols. And the slave patrols, they were tasked with basically chasing down runaway slaves, and preventing slave revolts. And so essentially the slave patrols were built on this idea of preserving the slavery system that existed at the time. And one of the first slave patrols that was founded was in the Carolinas, the Carolina colonies in 1704. And so the two kind of entities, they are basically one and the same, because their idea is that they're supposed to sort of guard the community, protect the social order. But at that very early point in time, that's when we start seeing that there is this connection between law enforcement in the way they view Black people in the country. And so as we go on through history, we get to the Civil War time. And at that time, it was actually the military um, that was entrusted with the law enforcement duties while they occupied the South. And of course, we know military back then looks it looks a little different from the military today. But again, you start getting that foundation for viewing law enforcement agencies as this kind of military unit, or these ideas that we bring over from military forces start making their way into law enforcement, even that many years ago. And so, move forward, and I'm kind of just running through the history. I'm not going into too much detail, but moving forward into the Reconstruction era, and local sheriffs are again back in charge of, maintaining the social order in their area. Especially in the South, you start seeing them sort of just go back to the mentality of the earlier times when they had the slave patrols. And so essentially they're using their legal authority at that time to sort of continue enforcing segregation and disenfranchising the freed slaves. And we see this play out all the way through, even into the 20th century. It doesn't, we all can go online and view images from the civil rights movement, and you recall seeing sort of the civil rights activists on one side with law enforcement, state troopers, police officers on the other side, with the clubs and dogs and water hoses and all these things to kind of just go against what the activists were fighting for during that time. And this is only a few decades ago. For sure, most of our parents lived during that era. And maybe even some of us may have, depending on your age and where you grew up. So this is something that it's not even a generation, it's barely a generation removed from what we're seeing today. And again, you just keep asking yourself, like, why does this keep happening? Well, the precedent has been laid out. It's been something that our country has dealt with since the beginning of time. And so again, I go back to this idea of, well, what does it mean to be an officer or involved in law enforcement? And so, the idea that is that's serving as the foundation for that is this idea of, public order. And the definition of what public order means, I mean, it varies just depending on who you're talking to. But one of the things that we're starting to see more of, especially now more so than ever, is this idea that there is an us and there's a them. And so when new officers are being trained in the academy, there's this sort of indoctrination of, there's us, those of us who are on the force, and then there's them, that's everybody else who's out there in the public. And as a result, we're having more and more police departments, law enforcement agencies who are becoming more so inward looking. And isolated from the public. And the thing we have to remember is that the purpose, one of the things that we always hear is that officers are there to serve and protect. Well, who they're serving is the public. But again, we're finding the situation where they're becoming even more so isolated from the public. And, you know, we hear talk, even just yesterday, you know, I heard someone mentioning, you know, Blue Lives Matter, and you think it's not about like, why do we have this division? Why is there this separation? Why do you have to try to pick apart officers away from the community as if they're not a part of the community? They are, and they're there to serve the community. So there shouldn't be this notion that for some reason their lives should mean something more than the community members that they're serving. But the one last thing I'll touch on is that, especially us as attorneys, we probably more so understand this idea of a justified killing, or, you know, a legal justification for an officer having to kill someone. And we know that that happens, but I think the larger question that we have to continue to focus on is it morally justified? You know, George Floyd, many people will say his family received justice yesterday with the verdict, but I would challenge you to look at it in a different way. For them, justice would be having him still alive. It's not the fact that this former officer was found guilty. It is having George Floyd still here with them. And so, you know, think about that as you think about, or as you see all the killings that are continuing to happen. Again, as attorneys, we understand that there are times when police shootings and killings may happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is morally justified. And if you need just another thing to kind of be the icing on the cake, slavery was legal. So, you know, I'll end with that. And definitely open to questions, and maybe another time I can jump on the topic of education, because that's something else that I'm happy to talk about as well.
Thank you, Jesse. I want to dig deeper into some of those issues, but first I want to give Jackie a chance to speak and mention anything we may have missed, or give her thoughts on what's been said, or on something new. So take it away, Jackie.
Thanks. Wow, you guys. Thank you so much, Jesse and Connie. You have definitely given all of us a lot to think about. And I think the theme that I heard from both of you is that thread of history. When we look at what's going on today, you know, it's important to keep that in mind. So Connie mentioned sort of the assimilation phase of dealing with Native peoples, and that trauma that was perpetrated on that community, that still plays a significant role. Most of you know I do some child welfare or dependency work, and you know, I'll just give you a story to kind of really personalize how this can play out. Native families are disproportionately likely to end up in the foster care system, having to deal with, you know, child welfare agencies. And I had this case a while back. My youth client was living with his mother, or not his mother, I'm sorry, his older sister, his adult sister, and everything was going fine. She had to go out of town for work, so she left the kids in the care of their adult brother. She didn't tell the department about it because she thought everything was fine. She wasn't sure when she was going to be back. They were in good hands. And so when the department found out about this, as you can imagine, they threw a hissy fit. Even though the brother had been cleared that there wasn't really any issues regarding safety, there weren't any health or safety concerns. So we have to have a meeting about all of this. And the caseworker looked across at the family and said, you guys need to trust me. You guys need to communicate with me. And, you know, I very promptly interrupted her and said, I'm sorry, you know, our social workers are disproportionately white women, right? So I had to interrupt her. And I said to her, I said, I need you to understand this community and what this family, what the value system of this family and their community is and what their history is. We're talking about a tribe that their kids were removed from their families. They don't trust government systems. So what are you doing to build trust within this family? Because that is her responsibility, in my opinion. But then when you look at the treatment of native lands, I mean, this is the basis of, you know, out here, we are constantly having conversations about water rights and things like that. And it's really tough. So we have to understand that not just the Native community, but the Black community as well, have more touch points with some of these systems that cause further harm. You know, again, Black families are disproportionately represented in the foster care system. So why is that, right? These communities are typically economically disadvantaged, right? Or disproportionately so, I should say. So they are more likely to come into contact with mandatory reporters and catch the eyeballs of the system, so to speak. Now, when we kind of look at, you know, Jesse, a couple of phrases that you said, or a couple of things that you said kind of hit with me, you know, this policing, you know, being a us versus them situation. You know, officers are not necessarily living in the communities that they're supposed to be serving. And I've heard, you know, some departments are offering incentives or placing that as a requirement, or looking at examining whether or not that's feasible. And I think that that's really great because, you know, if you are forced to understand the people that that are around you, you know, you're going to be able to better serve them and understand the needs of that community, right? If you know Johnny down the street, you know, likes to go down and sit on this corner, you're less likely to harass them, you know. But I also think that there's something to be said about how selectively, I see your question, Jenna, I'll get to that in just a second. How selective enforcement of laws, how that's seen, right? We give officers a lot of discretion about who they stop, who they talk to, what catches their eye. And you know, that's everything from speeding to loitering, right? We have, you know, all of that stuff. And that can be problematic when you take into account implicit bias, which is reinforced by the history that Jesse outlined regarding the initial purpose of the police and how that has evolved now to the very militarized presence that they have. What I always find is interesting is that you know, communities and areas of communities are certainly profiled, right? And then statistics are used to reinforce a larger police presence in that area. So I just think it's really important to question how and why these decisions are made. Where did they come from? And kind of step up and say, okay, but this isn't working. This isn't appropriate. And we need to think of a better way to do it. A lot of times people think that simply small changes or tweaking the system is all that needs to be done. But given the very, very frankly disgusting history that we have with policing, that we have with our treatment of Native people, we have to really rethink the entire systems. And I just can't emphasize that enough. Fred, can you please mute yourself? Sorry, I'm getting a lot of background noise from you. You know, Jesse talked about justice for George Floyd, and you know, I had a whole roller coaster of emotions too, because there's a huge I was just saying regarding the George Floyd verdict yesterday, or the Chauvin verdict yesterday, you know, there's a huge difference between accountability, which I think is what we were seeing yesterday, versus justice, because justice implies some level of equity and fair treatment. And I don't think we're there yet. You know, Jenna, you asked about, you know, being a part of the community as, you know, in sprawling metro areas. And, you know, I do definitely think that that's difficult. I know here in Tacoma, it's fine. We have a lot of different pockets, and it almost goes block by block. And in terms of whether we see police presence there or not, right? And I think whether it's requiring police officers to kind of rotate throughout the city and really get to know that community. I mean, I think my opinion is that yes, living in that community is helpful, but there are also ways to become part of the community, engaging in community events, right? And all over that city or all over that metro area as a police force, right? And making that investment. But I also think that that starts with demilitarizing, because I don't think that you're going to get any community members to trust you if your response is to show up, or the only time they see you, you're, you know, got a bunch of armor on, you are armed to the guild, and are rolling up in a reinforced SUV, right? So I definitely think that helps with that community policing. Again, the living there, I think is a bonus. I definitely appreciate the efforts that some departments are making to require people live in the surrounding area, but I think it goes beyond that and really, really important, right? So, yeah, Jen, I can see your comment, and yeah, it's getting involved. So you participating in events at the community center? Are you mentoring young kids in that area outside of your normal duties, right? I don't know. I think it comes down to relationship building. So it just, I wish I knew something more to say other than that, right? It's just so easy to see the common threads.
Jackie, can I add in something?
Yeah.
So when you have officers, and this applies just not to officers. I mean, we see this in education. We see
sure.
it in many areas of having the professional actually live in the neighborhood that they're serving. You then become a stakeholder. And so you're going to want to see that community thrive. And you're going to want to, even if you're an introvert and you're pretty antisocial, you're still going to want to get to know your neighbors. You're going to want to build those relationships that Jackie's talking about. You're going to want to, have the best interests of everyone who lives around you, because that's your community. That's where you're from. When officers or teachers or social workers or anybody is living outside of that community, then it does become just more of a job. It becomes more of a paycheck. It becomes, just something that you do so that you can survive. But then you're removing yourself away from that place every day. So there's sort of that starts building that sort of disconnect.
That detachment.
Yeah, because you don't really have anything that links you to it, because you could easily go get a job, anywhere else. And so that's, my 2 cents forward. And then when you're done, Jackie, I'll throw in one thing that I forgot to mention.
Okay. Well, and I was just gonna say, my local police department, I mean, their contract actually indicates that they're supposed to be, they're some of the highest paid officers in the state. I actually think that they're the highest paid, and that's per their contract. So anytime some other police force gets a raise, they have to come to the table and implement a raise. And I just think part of it is an incentive, because it's hard to get officers here, because Tacoma is very special. But it's kind of disgusting that's what's drawing officers here, right? Like you said, Jesse, it just becomes a paycheck, So I think building those community attachments is just critical. But I also think that starts with, I think that will remove some of the us versus them, that not just the police feel, but the community feels, right? But I also think that comes with disarming the police. It starts with having services available for mental health crises, substance abuse treatment for individuals, affordable housing for individuals, right? Loitering laws are a huge issue in a lot of communities, specifically because how they're selectively enforced. And an interesting thing that they did in Spokane is they took that, and if you got a low-level ticket like that, like loitering, they would have community court days where the judge would come down and the prosecutor would come down and the defense department would come down to the library, which is super accessible, along with other community organizations, mental health providers, housing advocates, all of these services and kind of surround this community, right? Which I thought was a really interesting idea that's been quite successful. So yeah, I mean, I think just building that community, providing services, and understanding that we don't have to respond to everything with guns drawn and tanks ready to go, right? With that, Jesse, add your point.
Thank you, Jackie. So, sorry, and I do apologize for my kind of dragging voice. I've been under the weather a few days here, but so one of the things I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention when we're looking at this whole idea of holding officers accountable and the us versus them mentality and supporting Blue lives, supporting Black lives, or just whatever. I don't know when it's going to get better, but one of the things that I found out yesterday and early this morning is that there's actually a bill that is going through the Oklahoma legislature right now that would make it a crime to video a police officer. And from my understanding, I have to do more research into this, I admit, but from my understanding, it is just simply if just filming an officer is going to become a crime in Oklahoma if this bill becomes law. And so your first offense is a misdemeanor, and then every time after that, it would be a felony. So just you're going down the street, you see, you know, someone, I guess, being arrested or something, or having an encounter with a group of officers, and you start filming it, well, you would be charged with a crime in the state of Oklahoma.
Jesse,
if this becomes law.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'd also be willing to bet that there are very few departments there that require their officers to wear body cams, right? So there's absolutely zero.
Like I said, it's instead of us figuring out different ways to hold officers accountable, we're now placing that burden on the citizens, who again, officers are there to protect and serve. And we would not even have the George Floyd, we wouldn't have this verdict if there had not been people who videoed it and were able to hold this officer accountable. So what is Oklahoma saying to its citizens and to the rest of the country? And I'm pretty sure that they're not the only state that is going to try something like this. But you know, you have to ask yourself, like, why is there such a resistance to just holding people accountable? And everyone is held accountable. Every one of us, we have professional rules that we have to live by, and that's whether we are seen or not. Like, you within yourself know that, hey, I have to uphold the ethics that are meaningful to me as an attorney. As a teacher, you have standards that you have to follow. Every professional has standards that they must follow, and you have to be held accountable whether you know if you fail to reach those standards. So why not officers?
Particularly given the importance of the work they do. I mean, I definitely think there are some situations in which, you know, police are helpful, necessary, what have you. But I think that those situations are very narrow. I think, you know, like there's not very many situations in which I feel like an incident is best resolved by the police, right?
And I can tell you, so for those of you who don't know me, my professional background, one of the jobs I did was I served as a dispatcher with
I did not know
911.
that about you, Jesse. Wow.
Yes, I was a 911 dispatcher, a few years ago out of college.
Wow.
It's just a job I had. But in that role, I worked with all emergency management offices within the county. So I worked with fire, I worked with EMT, and I worked with the local sheriff's department and the local police departments. We had about 6 in my county. So 6 or 7 different law enforcement agencies within my one county. And I worked with all of them. And so I have been, as the dispatcher, the call comes into my center, and I have been the person on the call with a victim of domestic violence, with someone in the background who is like literally, going off on them, hitting them, or brandishing a weapon. Like, I've heard the gunshots. I've been the person who's had to call the department and say, I need an officer to respond to this address, shots fired. Like, that's literally how I would have to, call it out over the radio. So I know while I wasn't out in the field with them, I'm their ears and their lifeline in the center, who is, having to document everything that's happening with them. I've heard officers on chases. I've heard them, encounter people and end up fighting, just all of these things. So I understand the need for, or the justification sometimes for using force, or using even deadly force sometimes, is it happens because you never know what type of call is going to come through. But at that same time, we still have to hold people accountable for those instances where it isn't justified and you don't need it, or some other de-escalation tactic could have been used, because one life loss, one innocent life loss is just one too many in my book.
We are getting close to 1, so I do want to sum up and give our panelists a chance to briefly conclude. I did schedule this till 1:15, but if folks need to leave, the recording will be available on our Facebook page, Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter. We'll also probably need to have at least another one of these because we have a lot to talk about. One thing that struck me that Jackie and Jesse both mentioned is this relationship of trust. And I think that's so important in community policing, because the police are there to serve and protect. How can they do that if the community doesn't trust them? And if the police don't live in the community that they patrol, I think that's a problem. We did find out today that the Department of Justice announced an investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. So it will be interesting to see what comes of that. If we get some real reforms, like Jackie said, I think we need to rethink the entire system, and the militarization of law enforcement, and just sending them out to deal with everything to do with mental health issues. And I know Jackie needs to leave. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give Jesse and Connie a chance to speak for a few minutes about what kind of issues we're dealing with now. I know we got a lot into current issues, and there's a lot to talk about. What are a couple of the pressing ones, and what do we need to talk more about in future sessions? And I'll let Connie go first.
I think now it's really just an issue of making sure that not only are tribal voices being heard, but that we extend our platforms to them to make sure that their voices are being heard. And I think it's a really interesting movement that's going on right now, where we are starting to amplify a lot more of those voices, and they are definitely starting to have a lot of really good results. One thing that I consistently refer back to is like the mascot issue, and making sure that we are aware of how harmful a lot of these stereotypical images are. And I think that a lot of that really wouldn't have been elevated to the level that it has been if it wasn't for like the Black Lives Matter movement and for other activists for making sure that we amplify those voices on a national level. And it also helps us give rise to other issues that have definitely been plaguing a lot of tribal communities, like missing and murdered Indigenous people. That is a very big issue that is still going on right now. And thanks to a lot of the grassroots activism, it's starting to get a lot more notice on a federal level, and people are trying to work on that and making sure that we can keep our people safe. And a lot of the stuff that Jesse and Jackie talked about earlier, it's a lot different in tribal communities when it comes to law enforcement, because the way to think about it is tribal law enforcement is very different compared to how it is like on a state level or even on a federal level. It's very different to the point where they still don't have access to a lot of most basic resources. And it's just something that we have to be cognizant of, is that one size solutions don't fit every situation, and especially for tribal communities. Different tribes have different types of jurisdiction, which is something that I alluded to in my presentation. And those jurisdictional issues are definitely have a huge effect on how we're going to address a lot of these problems, not only just in our communities, but also in our neighboring communities as well. So that's definitely something to keep on the forefront of your mind, is that we have some solutions, but we have to make sure that not only are we going to recognize that these might not necessarily fit tribal communities, but that tribal communities and tribal leadership and grassroots activisms from tribal people are going to be the ones who will be able to give us the best solutions for our people and our communities. And we always need to make sure that we include those voices when we are addressing a lot of these different needs.
Thank you, Connie. We still have a lot to cover. Jesse, close us out.
Yeah, so not going to hold you long. It's time for lunch here. But I just want to first say thank you to Corey for the invite, and thank you to the Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter for organizing these talks to discuss some of these issues, because there's a lot happening, and it's good to see that there are allies and people out there who are interested and want to learn more about it, and each of us can do something in our own little way in regards to current criminal justice issues. Of course, we're dealing with law enforcement, transparency, and accountability, and ways that we can go about bringing that to the forefront that is fair to the communities as well as fair to the officers, because we don't want to. There are a lot of good officers out there, and unfortunately they're being lumped into the group with those who may not be good officers. Then also, you have to touch on mental health, and law enforcement officers. They are not trained in. They're not trained in mental health, so it is not their duty to kind of go out there and deal with some of the mental health issues that they're encountering. We need professionals who are trained in that area to be a part of that process, so that we don't end up killing or locking up people who have mental health or behavioral issues. Being locked up is not the place for them to get those issues resolved. So that's something that our country as a whole has to kind of start looking at even more. And then, of course, you see this happening throughout the country. In certain states, it's mostly happening on a local level, at the city level, I've seen. And that is our drug laws. A lot of places are now making marijuana legal in certain places. But if you recall, going back to the 80s and the 90s, when there was this huge push for the criminalization of a lot of individuals based on drug laws that are now, kind of the opposite. And so, like, what do we do for those individuals who serve so many years in the prison system, and who basically were part of that mass incarceration era that we lived through in the 90s? What do we do for them? And then lastly, just, looking at incarceration itself. What purpose does it serve? Is it really necessary to lock up these nonviolent offenders in the way that we've been doing over the last few decades? And so, those are just a few things that we can touch on. But again, thank you to everyone for spending your part of your afternoon with us, and look forward to future discussions.
Thanks everyone for attending. I'll leave you with this. Just keep reaching out to each other. Ask how are you really doing? Get past that initial hello. Minnesota's had a tough time lately. A lot of places have had a tough time. So I appreciate those who have reached out to see how we're really doing. And I think talking to each other is the way we're going to start to resolve these issues. So let's keep having these conversations. Thank you all. Take care.